The front desk clerk hesitated before sliding the envelope across the counter. I noticed it immediately. Not the envelope, the pause, the careful look she gave the screen, then me. "Your family already checked in," she said gently. "They left instructions." I nodded. Of course they did. Family reunions always come with instructions when you are the quiet one. The one who never argues. The one everyone assumes will accept whatever is handed to him. She opened the envelope and glanced at the paper inside. Then her expression changed, just slightly. Not shock, not confusion, something closer to discomfort. "They booked you," she said slowly, "in the economy room." Behind me, the lobby hummed with polite music and quiet conversations. But the system on her screen already knew something my family did not. And systems do not lie. Family reunions in my family have always followed a pattern, not a written one, nothing anyone would admit to. But patterns reveal themselves when you stay quiet long enough. The louder relatives decide the schedule. The more confident ones choose the locations. And the rest of us simply arrive when we are told to. I have always belonged to the second group, the ones who arrive, the ones who listen, the ones who do not argue when plans are already made. My cousins used to joke that I had the easiest role in the family. "No responsibility," one of them said years ago. "You just show up and eat." Everyone laughed, including me. At the time, it felt easier to laugh than to explain the difference between silence and absence. I was not absent from the family. I was simply not competing for space inside it. That difference rarely matters to people who speak first. This reunion had been planned for months. The messages appeared in the family group chat in the usual way, short announcements followed by long threads of opinions from the same 4 people who always had opinions. Resort suggestions, dates, room categories, budget discussions. My phone lit up with notifications for days, but I rarely participated in the conversation. Not because I disagreed with anything, but because my participation was never required. Eventually, a final message appeared. Reservations were confirmed. Rooms had been assigned. Everyone simply needed to arrive on Friday afternoon. No one asked if the arrangements worked for me. They never had before. I assumed everything had been handled the same way it always was, quickly, loudly, and with confidence that no one would object. The resort itself was familiar, not because I had stayed there before, but because places like it exist in almost every coastal region. Large glass windows, carefully trimmed palm trees, and a lobby designed to look calm even when it is full of people arriving at the same time. My taxi stopped beneath the entrance canopy just after sunset. The driver unloaded my single suitcase and left. I stood there for a moment watching the lobby through the glass doors. Inside, people were checking in, couples, families, employees moving with quiet efficiency behind the front desk. I noticed something I always notice in places like that. Systems, not the obvious ones, not the computers or reservation software. The quieter systems. The way employees read small signals. How they recognize returning guests. How certain names cause their posture to change slightly. Most people never see those details. They are busy thinking about vacations. I walked inside. The air conditioning carried the faint scent of polished wood and citrus cleaner. A piano track played softly from hidden speakers. 2 receptionists were helping guests while a third worked at a computer near the side of the counter. No one paid special attention to me, which was exactly what I expected. My family had already arrived earlier that afternoon. That much I knew from the messages they sent. Photos had appeared in the chat hours earlier, group selfies in the lobby, comments about the ocean view, complaints about the heat outside. Someone mentioned that the suites were bigger than expected. Another cousin joked that he might refuse to leave after the weekend. I read those messages during the drive from the airport. I did not reply, not because I felt excluded, just because the conversation was already moving fast enough without me. A moment later, one of the receptionists looked up and offered a polite smile. "Good evening," she said. I returned the smile and stepped forward. "Good evening." She asked for my name. I gave it. Her fingers moved across the keyboard as she searched the reservation system. Nothing unusual about that moment. In fact, it felt almost identical to hundreds of check-ins I had watched over the years. Name, reservation, room key. A simple exchange. But small moments often carry quiet information if you are patient enough to watch them carefully. Her eyes paused on the screen, just for a second. Then she clicked something and glanced at another window. Her expression remained professional, but there was a brief shift in focus, something I have seen many times before in hospitality environments. Recognition, not of me personally, of the name. She reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small envelope. It had already been prepared. That detail caught my attention, not because it was strange, but because it suggested something had been arranged earlier. My family had clearly completed the group check-in. They probably left instructions for the last arrival, which in our family was often me. The receptionist held the envelope for a moment before sliding it across the counter. "Your family already checked in," she said gently. I nodded. That part was expected. Then she added something that made the moment pause. "They left instructions." I noticed the hesitation before she opened the envelope. Not fear, not confusion, just a careful pause. The kind employees take when they realize a situation might become uncomfortable for someone standing in front of them. I did not say anything. Silence gives people space to finish what they started. She read the note inside. Then she looked at the computer screen again. The pause returned. Only slightly longer this time. Finally, she looked back at me. "They booked you," she said slowly, "in the economy room." Behind me, the lobby music continued without interruption. And somewhere inside the resort system, a record already existed explaining exactly how that decision had been made. I simply had not read it yet, but systems remember everything. I thanked the receptionist, not because the room category mattered to me, but because courtesy is a habit that rarely depends on circumstance. She handed me a key card and a folded map of the property. "The elevators are down the hall to your left," she said. "The economy rooms are located in the south wing." South wing. The way she said it sounded slightly careful, as if the word itself required gentle handling. I nodded again. Then I picked up my suitcase and walked toward the elevators. No one stopped me. No one asked if there had been a mistake. The resort hallway was quiet, lined with framed photographs of the coastline from decades earlier. Black and white images of fishing boats, old wooden piers, families standing on beaches that no longer looked the same. Places change slowly. Families change even slower. The elevator arrived almost immediately. Inside, I pressed the button for the third floor, the south wing. While the doors closed, I remembered the photos my cousins had posted earlier that afternoon. Wide balconies, large sitting areas. Someone had joked about hosting card games in one of the suites because the living room was bigger than his apartment. The messages had been filled with excitement. No one mentioned room assignments in detail, just jokes about who had the best views. I had assumed the rooms were distributed in the usual way, first come, first served, or perhaps grouped by households. Families together, couples together. Single travelers placed wherever space remained. That kind of arrangement would have made sense. But the envelope at the front desk suggested something more deliberate. The elevator doors opened. The south wing was noticeably quieter than the main hallway near the lobby. The lighting was softer. the carpet older. Not neglected, but clearly designed for shorter stays and simpler expectations. Economy guests rarely complain about decor. They usually stay only 1 or 2 nights. My room was near the end of the corridor. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was clean, simple. A bed, a desk, a window facing the parking lot. No balcony, no ocean view. The kind of room designed for efficiency rather than comfort. I set my suitcase beside the desk and looked out the window. From this angle, I could see the entrance road leading to the resort gates. Cars arriving, taxis leaving, guests rolling luggage across the pavement. Nothing about the room itself bothered me. Rooms are temporary spaces, but the arrangement raised a quiet question, not about comfort, about intention. I unpacked slowly, placing a few things in the dresser drawers, then washed my hands in the bathroom sink. A message appeared on my phone while I was drying them. The family group chat. My cousin Daniel had posted another photo. This one showed 8 people sitting around a large table on a balcony, ocean behind them. Dinner plates already half empty. "Where are you?" the caption read. "Come join us." I looked at the picture carefully. The balcony was wide, large enough for at least 12 chairs. The message thread beneath it filled quickly. Someone joked that I had probably already disappeared somewhere quiet. Another cousin replied with a laughing emoji. "Classic." I typed a short response. "Just checked in, I'll come upstairs." A moment later, Daniel replied again. "Penthouse level, suite 4. Penthouse. That word lingered on the screen for a moment, not because I envied the room, but because it clarified something important. Room assignments had not been random. Economy rooms and penthouse suites do not exist in the same distribution category. Someone had chosen those placements intentionally. Still, families often organize things unevenly. Certain relatives pay more. Certain relatives request upgrades. Sometimes people simply prefer larger spaces. None of that automatically meant anything was wrong. I closed the suitcase and left the room. The elevator ride to the top floor took longer this time. 2 other guests stepped in along the way. A couple discussing spa reservations. They did not notice me. When the elevator reached the penthouse level, the hallway looked noticeably different. Brighter lighting, newer carpet, large windows facing the ocean. At the end of the hall, I could already hear voices, laughter. The sliding door to the balcony was open. Daniel spotted me first. "There he is," he said loudly. Several heads turned. My aunt raised a hand in greeting. Someone pulled out an empty chair. "Finally," Daniel added. "We thought you got lost." I sat down. The ocean breeze moved across the table. Plates, glasses, half-finished drinks. Everyone looked relaxed, comfortable. The conversation resumed almost immediately. Vacation plans for the next day, pool reservations, a boat tour someone wanted to book. I listened for a few minutes before asking the simplest question available. "Which room did everyone get?" The table grew quiet for half a second, not silent, just a small interruption. Daniel shrugged. "Different ones," he said casually. "Depends who booked early." Another cousin added, "Yeah, we just filled up the suites." Someone laughed. "You know how these things work." I nodded. Of course I did. But across the table, my aunt looked at me with a small crease between her eyebrows. "Where did they put you?" she asked. I answered simply. "South wing." Her expression changed for a moment. Then she reached for her glass and said nothing more. The conversation continued, but something had already shifted. Small, quiet, the kind of shift that only becomes visible if you keep watching long enough. And I intended to watch very carefully. The balcony dinner lasted almost 2 hours, long enough for the sky to turn from orange to dark blue, and for the table to slowly fill with empty glasses and quiet fatigue. Family conversations tend to follow familiar rhythms. Someone tells a story everyone has already heard. Someone else exaggerates details until the story becomes louder than the truth. Then eventually the conversation breaks into smaller circles, side discussions, private jokes, small alliances forming around shared memories. I stayed mostly quiet, not because I felt excluded, but because observation has always felt more useful than participation. When people speak freely, they reveal things they do not realize they are revealing. At one point, Daniel leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms. "This place was a great choice," he said. He said it loudly, as if claiming responsibility. My cousin Melissa nodded. "Your idea," she said. "You and Mark found it." Mark raised his glass slightly. "Well," he said, "we did the research." A few people laughed. Then my uncle asked the question that shifted the direction of the conversation. "How expensive were these suites?" Mark waved his hand dismissively. "Not as bad as they look," he said. "Group discount." "How much?" my uncle repeated. Mark hesitated. Then he said a number. Several people reacted immediately. "Seriously? That's lower than I expected." Melissa leaned forward. "We got lucky with timing," she explained. "The resort had availability for the whole weekend." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, penthouse suites were open." Someone else asked, "All of them?" "Pretty much," Daniel said. I noticed the wording carefully. Pretty much. Not exactly. That phrase tends to appear when someone wants to simplify a more complicated explanation. Across the table, my aunt looked at me again. Not directly, just briefly. Then she returned her attention to her plate. The conversation moved forward. People began discussing the booking process, how quickly the rooms filled, who had sent payments, who still owed their share. But something inside the story did not align. Mark had said the suites were available. Daniel had said most of them were open. And the group clearly had the budget to reserve them. So the question formed quietly in my mind. Why was one person placed in the economy wing? That kind of decision usually appears in one of two ways. Either the cheaper room is requested, or it is assigned deliberately. A few minutes later, I stood up to refill my water glass inside the suite's kitchen area. From that position, I could hear two voices behind me near the balcony railing. Melissa and Daniel. They were speaking quietly, assuming no one nearby was paying attention. "He already checked in?" Melissa asked. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "You told them about the room." Daniel paused. "I didn't have to," he said. "The desk had instructions." "Instructions?" Melissa lowered her voice further. "Do you think he noticed?" Daniel gave a small laugh. "He never notices anything." That sentence was delivered casually, almost kindly, but it carried a long history behind it. In our family, my quietness had always been interpreted the same way, not as observation, not as patience, as absence. The assumption had existed for years. If something happened quietly, I would never question it. I filled my glass and returned to the table without interrupting their conversation. A few minutes later, the group began discussing room views. Who had the best angle of the ocean? Which balcony received the sunset? Daniel pointed toward the hallway. 3 suites on this side, he explained. 2 on the other, Mark added, and the big corner one. My aunt asked, "How many rooms does that one have?" 3 bedrooms, Daniel said. Mark and I split it. That statement created a small silence around the table, not because the arrangement was unusual, but because it confirmed something quietly important. The family had not simply booked individual rooms. They had planned the distribution carefully. Large suites for certain people, shared spaces for others, specific choices made during the reservation process. I waited until the conversation shifted again before asking another simple question. When did everyone book? Mark answered immediately. About 3 months ago, Melissa added. We had to confirm the list early so the resort could hold the rooms. Confirm the list, I asked. Daniel nodded. Yeah, names and room types. The air on the balcony felt slightly cooler now. Night had settled across the water. I looked at the ocean for a moment before speaking again. So the rooms were assigned ahead of time. Of course, Mark said. It's easier that way. Across the table, my aunt finally spoke again. Her voice was careful. Who made the final list? No one answered immediately. Daniel took a sip of his drink. Mark looked toward the ocean. Melissa adjusted the napkin on her lap. 3 small movements, 3 small pauses. Finally, Daniel shrugged. We all agreed on it, he said. The sentence sounded complete, but the details behind it were missing, and missing details tend to leave traces. Earlier that evening, the receptionist had paused before handing me the envelope. The system had displayed something on her screen, something she recognized, something connected to my name. At that moment, I realized something important. If the rooms had been assigned deliberately, then somewhere inside the resort's records, there would be a line explaining exactly who made that decision. And systems, unlike families, do not forget instructions. The next morning, the resort looked different in daylight. Sunlight moved across the water in wide silver lines, and the balconies along the upper floors filled with quiet conversations and breakfast trays. From the south wing window, I could see only a narrow slice of the ocean between 2 buildings. Mostly, I saw the parking lot. Delivery trucks arrived early. Staff members walked quickly between service entrances, systems beginning their day. I dressed slowly and went upstairs to meet the family for breakfast. They had chosen a restaurant inside the main building, large windows facing the beach, white tablecloths, the kind of place where staff refill coffee cups before guests notice they are empty. When I arrived, most of them were already seated. Daniel waved me over. There he is, he said again, the same tone he used the night before. Someone pulled out a chair. Menus lay open across the table. The conversation was already moving. Boat tour, spa reservations. A debate about whether the weather would stay clear for the weekend. For a while, I simply listened. Breakfast conversations are rarely important, but people reveal more in casual moments than they do in formal ones. Eventually, my aunt looked at me again, the same small crease between her eyebrows. Did you sleep well? She asked. Yes, I said. The room was fine. I said it calmly, not as a complaint, just a statement. Across the table, Daniel smiled. See, he said. Told you he wouldn't care. A few people laughed quietly. Melissa stirred her coffee. Honestly, she said, those rooms are perfectly good. I didn't say they weren't, I replied. Mark leaned forward slightly. Then what's the issue? There was no anger in his voice, just a subtle challenge. The kind people use when they want to define the boundaries of a conversation. I answered simply. I was curious how the assignments were made. Daniel shrugged again. Same way we always do things. Which is? I asked. First come, first served. The answer arrived quickly, too quickly. Melissa nodded in agreement. Exactly. Mark added, you know how chaotic family planning can be. The explanation sounded reasonable, almost convincing, but something about it did not match the facts already discussed the night before. Daniel said the rooms were assigned ahead of time, I said. Silence moved across the table for a brief moment. Not long, just enough for people to notice. Daniel smiled again. Yeah, assigned after people booked. That's what I meant, Melissa added softly. Maybe the resort made a mistake. Mark nodded. That happens. Their responses overlapped slightly. Different explanations offered at the same time. A common reaction when a group tries to stabilize a story quickly. I looked down at the tablecloth for a moment. White linen, perfectly pressed. Then I said something simple. The front desk said there were instructions. Daniel laughed lightly. Instructions? Yes. Probably just notes for the check-in process. Melissa nodded again. Hotels do that all the time. Mark leaned back in his chair. You're reading too much into it. That phrase appeared carefully, not aggressive, just dismissive. Across the table, someone else joined the conversation, my cousin Lee. She had been quiet until then. Honestly, she said, it's just a room. The statement was meant to calm the discussion, but it also reframed it. The subject was no longer the decision. It was my reaction. Daniel looked at me with a friendly expression. You've always been low maintenance, he said. That's why we figured it wouldn't matter. Figured, another word that reveals quiet assumptions. Melissa added, you travel alone most of the time anyway. Mark said, and you've never cared about luxury stuff. None of those statements were accusations, but together they formed a narrative, a new explanation. One that moved responsibility away from the decision itself and placed it gently onto me. You wouldn't mind. You don't care about comfort. You're easy. The conversation shifted again after that. Someone changed the topic to the afternoon's beach plans. Orders arrived. Coffee was refilled. But the air at the table had changed slightly. Not tense, just cautious. My aunt watched the conversation for several minutes before speaking again. Her voice was quiet. Did anyone actually ask him? The table paused again. Daniel gave a small shrug. It didn't seem necessary. Melissa said softly, we had limited rooms. Mark added, and everyone else was sharing. 3 answers, 3 partial explanations. None of them quite complete. I took a sip of coffee, warm, bitter. Then I asked one more question. Who sent the final instructions to the resort? This time the silence lasted longer. Not dramatic, just heavy enough to notice. Daniel looked toward Mark. Mark looked toward Melissa. Melissa adjusted her napkin again. Finally, Daniel said something that sounded almost casual. I handled the booking email. There it was, the first clear detail, a specific person connected to a specific action. I nodded once. Thank you, I said. No one responded to that. The conversation moved forward again, but more carefully now. People began choosing words with slightly greater precision, and something else had changed as well. For the first time since the reunion began, a few relatives were no longer looking at me as if I were simply the quiet one. They were starting to wonder why I was asking questions. After breakfast, the group scattered across the resort. Some went to the beach. Others reserved lounge chairs near the pool. Daniel and Mark talked about renting jet skis. Family reunions often divide this way once the first meal ends. People drift into smaller groups based on energy levels and habits. I chose to walk, not along the beach where most guests gathered, but through the quieter interior paths that connected the buildings. Resorts are designed like small cities, guest areas in front, operational areas behind, corridors for housekeeping, service doors marked staff only, elevators guests never notice. The structure interests me more than the scenery. Every place like this runs on invisible coordination. Schedules, logs, reservation notes. Small decisions recorded quietly in digital systems. The same systems that had produced the envelope at the front desk the night before. I stopped near the lobby cafe and ordered coffee. The barista placed the cup on the counter and smiled politely. Nothing unusual, just another guest starting his morning. I carried the coffee to a small table near the window. From there, I could see the reception desk clearly. 2 employees were helping new arrivals. Behind them, the same receptionist who checked me in the night before was reviewing something on her computer. She looked up briefly. Our eyes met for a moment. Recognition passed across her face. Not surprise, just awareness. She excused herself from the desk and walked toward the cafe area. Her steps were careful, professional. She stopped beside my table. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I replied. She hesitated slightly, not uncertain, just choosing her words. I hope the room was comfortable, she said. It was, I answered. She nodded, but her expression suggested she had something else to say. Employees in hospitality develop a quiet instinct about fairness. They recognize situations that feel unusual, even when they are not responsible for them. I wanted to clarify something, she said carefully. About the check-in. I listened. She lowered her voice slightly. Your family's reservation included detailed instructions about room assignments. I said nothing. She continued. That's not uncommon for large group bookings. Another pause. But the instructions were very specific. How so? I asked. She glanced briefly toward the reception desk, then back at me. The booking email listed each guest by name, she explained. Next to the room category they were supposed to receive. That matched what Daniel had said during breakfast. Names and room types. A confirmed list. But the next sentence carried more weight. Your name was the only one assigned to the economy category. I waited. Sometimes silence encourages people to continue. She did. The request was entered directly into the reservation system, she added. So the assignment wasn't generated automatically, meaning the system had not made the decision. Someone had given it instructions. Was there a reason listed? I asked. No, just the room type. Economy. Assigned beside my name. The receptionist seemed slightly uncomfortable now. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because the information itself felt personal. I assumed it was a preference, she said quietly. Sometimes guests request simpler rooms. I didn't, I said. She nodded slowly. Yes. That word carried quiet understanding. She straightened slightly, returning to her professional tone. If there is anything you need during your stay, please let us know. Then she walked back toward the front desk. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. But it clarified something important. The downgrade had not been random. It had been written, recorded, attached to my name inside the resort's reservation file. I finished my coffee slowly. Outside the window, a group of my relatives walked past the lobby entrance. Daniel was laughing about something. Mark was explaining directions to the beach. Melissa followed a few steps behind them. From a distance, they looked relaxed, comfortable inside the space they had reserved for themselves. A few minutes later, someone approached my table, my cousin Lee. She stood there for a moment before sitting down. You disappeared, she said. I went for coffee. She nodded, then she leaned slightly closer. I heard you were asking the front desk about the room. The information had traveled quickly. Families move information faster than resort staff ever could. I asked a question, I said. Lee looked toward the reception desk, then back at me. They probably think you're upset. I'm not. She studied my face for a moment. You don't look upset, she said. I'm not, I repeated. That seemed to confuse her slightly. Most people expect emotion when someone discovers they have been treated differently. Anger, embarrassment, something visible. But quiet observation often appears strange to people who are used to louder reactions. Lee lowered her voice. I overheard Daniel and Melissa talking earlier, she said. About the booking. I waited. She hesitated. Then she continued. They said the room list was discussed before the invitations went out. Before the invitations. That meant the assignments had been planned even earlier than the reservation itself. They assumed you wouldn't care, she added softly. The same assumption again, repeated by different people. A belief that had slowly solidified over years. Lee looked uncomfortable now. Honestly, she said, I thought you asked for it. I didn't, she nodded slowly. I know that now. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The lobby remained calm around us, guests arriving, staff moving quietly between counters, systems recording each transaction, each reservation update, each instruction entered into the database. Lee finally stood. I should go meet the others, she said. Of course. She walked toward the beach exit, But before she left the lobby, she looked back once, not suspicious, just thoughtful, as if something about the situation no longer made sense to her, and she wasn't the only one beginning to notice. Because inside the resort system, the booking file connected to my name had already triggered attention from someone else. Someone my family had not considered when they wrote those instructions. Someone who would eventually read every line attached to that reservation. By late afternoon, the atmosphere around the reunion had changed. Not dramatically. No arguments. No visible conflict. But conversations became shorter when I approached. Laughter paused half a second longer than usual. People glanced at one another before choosing what to say. Information travels quickly inside families, especially uncomfortable information. Someone had clearly told Daniel and Mark that I had spoken to the front desk, and that detail had begun circulating through the group. I found them near the pool. Daniel sat under a large umbrella with a drink balanced on the arm of his chair. Mark was scrolling through his phone beside him. A few cousins were swimming. Music played quietly from the poolside speakers, normal vacation sounds. Daniel looked up when he saw me. "There you are," he said. His tone sounded friendly, but the friendliness carried a thin layer of caution now. Mark looked up as well. "We heard you talk to the desk about the room," he said. Not a question, just a statement. I sat in the empty chair across from them. "Yes," I said. Daniel exhaled through his nose, half laughing. "Man," he said, shaking his head slightly, "you didn't have to involve hotel staff." "Involve them in what?" Mark answered before Daniel could. "In family stuff." The phrase family stuff appeared carefully, as if it defined a boundary. Internal matters should remain internal. I looked at the pool water for a moment. Children from another group splashed near the shallow end. Their parents watched from lounge chairs. Then I returned my attention to Daniel and Mark. I asked how the rooms were assigned. Daniel leaned forward. "That makes it sound like we did something wrong." "I didn't say that, but that's how it looks," Mark said. "To them." The word "them" referred to the resort staff, employees who were not part of the family, people who now knew something about the reservation instructions. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "You're creating a weird situation," he said. "Everyone's here to relax." "I'm relaxed." Mark gave a small laugh. "Then why dig into it?" The question sounded genuine. He truly seemed confused about my interest. For him, the decision had probably felt small. A simple logistical choice made months earlier. Assign the better rooms to certain people. Place the quiet cousin somewhere else. Problem solved. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Look," he said, "we weren't trying to insult you. I didn't assume you were, but you're acting like there's some conspiracy." I watched his face carefully. He believed what he was saying, not the details, but the framing. He believed the situation only became uncomfortable because I asked about it. Melissa approached the table then. She carried a towel over her shoulder and sat beside Daniel. "What's going on?" she asked. Mark answered quickly. "He asked the front desk about the rooms." Melissa's expression tightened slightly. "Why?" The question sounded sharper than the others. "I wanted to understand the booking instructions," I said. Melissa shook her head slowly. "You know how that looks to them." "Like what?" "Like we singled you out." The honesty of that sentence surprised even her. She realized it immediately. Her eyes moved toward Daniel. Daniel shifted in his chair. "That's not what happened," he said quickly. Melissa corrected herself. "I mean, it wasn't meant that way." Mark added, "It was just practical." Practical, another word used when someone wants to minimize the emotional weight of a decision. I asked the simplest question available. "What was practical about it?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said something that revealed more than he intended. "You're not around much." The sentence hung in the air. He continued before anyone could interrupt. "You skip most reunions." You don't care about this kind of thing. So we figured, he stopped. But the unfinished sentence was already clear, so we figured you wouldn't matter in the room distribution. Melissa tried to soften the explanation. It wasn't personal, she said. It was just easier. Mark nodded. And the economy rooms are still nice. The conversation had circled back to the same narrative introduced at breakfast. The room itself was acceptable, therefore the decision should not matter. But the room had never been the issue. The issue was the instruction, a deliberate entry inside the resort system. My name, next to a downgraded category, while every other relative received something else. I stood up slowly. Daniel looked relieved, assuming the conversation was ending. But before I walked away, I said something simple. The reservation file records every instruction. 3 pairs of eyes looked up at me. Mark frowned slightly. What do you mean? Every change, I said, every request. Daniel waved his hand dismissively. It's just a booking system. Yes, and systems keep records. Melissa shifted in her seat. Why does that matter? I looked toward the main building. From the pool area, I could see the upper floors of the resort. Balconies stacked above one another, glass reflecting the late afternoon sun. Because someone reviews those records, I said. Daniel laughed again, but the sound carried less confidence now. Who would review them? I met his eyes calmly. The people who run the resort. Mark leaned back. Well, good for them. He said it casually, as if the idea had no connection to us. As if the system behind the building we were sitting beside had nothing to do with the quiet conversation unfolding at the pool. I did not correct him, not yet, because another process had already started inside the resort, one that none of them could see. Earlier that morning, when the receptionist reopened the reservation file attached to my name, a small internal notification had appeared. Not an alarm, not an error. Just a flag. A routine system response tied to specific names in the company database. Names connected to ownership records. Names that triggered automatic visibility for management review. By the time the sun began setting over the ocean that evening, someone in the resort's operations office had already opened that file, and they were reading every line inside it. The evening dinner was quieter than the one the night before. Same balcony, same ocean view, but the conversation moved more carefully now. People chose neutral topics. Food, weather, travel plans for the following day. The room assignments were not mentioned again, not directly, but silence itself can carry meaning. I noticed how often Daniel glanced at me when he thought I was not looking, how Melissa avoided meeting my eyes when she passed plates around the table, how Mark spoke a little louder than usual, as if volume could smooth the tension that had begun to settle into the group. None of them believed the situation was serious. Not yet, but something had shifted inside their certainty. They had spent years assuming I would never question anything. Now I had asked questions, quiet ones, simple ones. And that alone had created a small fracture in the story they were comfortable telling themselves. Halfway through dinner, my aunt stood up and stepped inside the suite for a moment. When she returned, she paused beside my chair. "Would you mind helping me carry something downstairs?" she asked. Her voice sounded casual, but her eyes suggested she wanted privacy. I stood up. "Of course." We walked into the hallway together. The door closed behind us, muffling the sound of conversation from the balcony. For a moment, we simply stood there. The hallway lights reflected softly against the glass windows facing the ocean. Finally, she spoke. "I heard what happened at breakfast." I nodded. "People talk," she said. "They do." She folded her hands in front of her. "I also heard that you spoke with the front desk." "Yes." Her expression remained calm, but there was something thoughtful in the way she studied my face. "You're not angry," she said. "No, that surprises me." I considered the answer carefully. Anger usually changes nothing, I said. She gave a small nod. That sounds like you. We stood quietly for another moment, then she said something unexpected. I asked Daniel about the room assignments earlier. I waited. He said the list was organized based on who contributed the most money. That explanation was new, different from the ones offered earlier. First come, first served, practical, limited rooms, now contribution levels. Did you contribute? She asked. Yes. She nodded slowly. I thought so. She leaned lightly against the hallway railing. You know families, she said after a moment. People make decisions quickly. Sometimes without thinking. That's true. But sometimes, she continued, they make decisions because they think certain people won't push back. Her eyes held mine for a moment. Then she sighed quietly. You were always the calm one. That's what they say. And because of that, she said softly, they forget that calm people still see what's happening. The words were not accusatory, just honest. From inside the suite, laughter rose briefly from the dinner table. The others had not noticed our absence. My aunt straightened again. Whatever you decide to do, she said, I hope you keep your dignity. I intend to, she smiled faintly. I never doubted that. We walked back toward the suite door together. Before she opened it, she paused again. One more thing, she said. Yes. The staff here, I waited. They seem very attentive to you. Her observation was subtle, but accurate. Throughout the afternoon, several employees had greeted me with quiet recognition. A concierge who addressed me by name. A pool attendant who adjusted my chair without being asked. Small gestures, almost invisible unless someone was paying close attention. My aunt had noticed. They're attentive to all guests, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she nodded. Of course. When we returned to the table, the conversation continued as if nothing had happened. Dessert arrived. Coffee followed. But the evening carried a quiet heaviness now, not because anyone was openly confronting the issue, but because the truth had begun to settle into the spaces between people. Daniel noticed the staff member who approached our table near the end of the meal. A manager, well-dressed, calm posture. He spoke briefly with the server, then glanced in my direction. Just a quick look. Professional. But deliberate. Daniel followed the glance. So the staff knows you now, he asked casually. I've spoken to a few people, I said. Mark smirked slightly. Must be nice. The manager left the dining area without approaching the table. No announcement, no interruption, just quiet observation. Daniel leaned back in his chair again. You know, he said, this whole thing is getting blown out of proportion. Melissa nodded. It's just a room. The same sentence again. A phrase repeated often enough to make it feel true. But inside the resort's administrative office, several floors below us, the reservation file connected to our family's booking remained open on a computer screen. Every instruction was visible, every assigned name, every room category, and attached to that file was something else, an ownership profile, a record linking the reservation to a name that appeared in a completely different part of the company database. My name. The same name written beside the economy room. The same name that appeared on the documents establishing the company that owned the resort chain itself. None of my relatives had looked at those records. They had only looked at me, and they believed they already understood my place in the family. But systems do not rely on assumptions. They rely on facts, and facts were beginning to move quietly through the resort's management structure. Soon, someone would come speak with me directly, not as a guest, but as something my family had never considered. The next morning, the air felt heavier, not because of the weather. The sky was clear, the ocean calm, the beach already filling with early swimmers. But something inside the family group had grown quieter. Conversations paused more often. People watched one another before speaking. The tension was subtle, like a pressure change that only becomes noticeable after it has already happened. I left my room in the south wing just after 8. The hallway was empty. Housekeeping carts waited beside a service elevator. Somewhere down the corridor, a vacuum cleaner hummed softly. Routine operations, the building waking up. When I reached the lobby, the same receptionist from my first night looked up again. Her expression changed slightly when she saw me, not surprise, recognition. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." Before either of us could continue, another employee approached from the side corridor. Older, gray suit, calm, professional posture. His pace slowed when he reached the desk. Then he turned toward me. "Sir," he said politely, "may I have a moment of your time?" His voice carried the careful tone of someone used to speaking with guests in private. The receptionist stepped slightly aside. I nodded. "Of course." He gestured toward a quiet seating area near the windows. We sat across from one another. For a moment he simply folded his hands and looked at me, not searching, just confirming something. "My name is Adrian Cole," he said. "I'm the regional operations director for this property." I recognized the title immediately. Every resort in the chain reported through someone with that position. "Thank you for meeting with me," he continued. "There's a reservation under your family's group booking that came to our attention yesterday." I waited. He spoke calmly. No urgency, no accusation, just procedure. "Our internal system flagged the reservation because of the name attached to one of the room assignments." He paused briefly, then added something that shifted the meaning of the conversation completely. "Your name." Across the lobby, a family checked out at the front desk. Suitcases rolled across the marble floor. Normal morning sounds. Adrian continued. "Whenever a reservation includes the name of a registered ownership partner, the system alerts regional management." Ownership partner. A phrase rarely spoken out loud in daily operations, but one that exists in legal documents, financial records, and corporate structures. "I assume you're aware of that policy," he said. "Yes," he nodded slightly. "The room assignment attached to your name was unusual." Not wrong, not offensive, just unusual, because ownership partners were never placed in economy categories during internal reviews, not by system standards, not by corporate policy. Adrian opened a tablet in front of him. The reservation file appeared on the screen. I could see the details clearly. Family group booking, multiple suites, individual names, and one line near the bottom, my name, economy room. "According to the booking log," Adrian said calmly, "this assignment was entered manually through the original reservation request." I said nothing. He continued. "The system recorded the email address used to submit the instructions. Daniel S. Though Adrian did not say it out loud. He did not need to. "We do not normally intervene in guest booking preferences," he explained. "But when a registered partner appears in the reservation file, we review the situation to ensure there has been no error." "Understood," I said. Adrian studied my face for a moment. "You have the option to relocate to any suite currently available," he said. "There are several open this weekend." The offer sounded routine, professional, but I shook my head. "I'll remain where I am." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "As you wish." He closed the tablet. "One more thing," he added. "The management staff has been informed that you are on the property." I nodded again. "That isn't necessary." "It's standard protocol," he said gently. We both stood. The conversation had lasted only a few minutes. Across the lobby, the front desk continued assisting guests. Vacation routines carried on uninterrupted. Adrian extended his hand. "Please let us know if you require anything during your stay." "I will." He walked toward the administrative corridor behind the reception desk. Quiet, professional, invisible to most guests, but the system had already done its work. Within the hour, several small changes began appearing around the resort. Nothing dramatic, just subtle adjustments. A concierge greeting me by name. A staff member quietly ensuring a table was available when I entered the restaurant. The kind of attentive behavior normally reserved for executives and ownership visits. My family noticed. Of course they did. At lunch, Daniel watched the staff interactions carefully. Mark stopped speaking mid-sentence when a manager approached our table to ask if everything was satisfactory. Melissa's eyes moved between the manager and me, confusion spreading slowly across her expression. Finally, Daniel asked the question, "What's going on with the staff here?" I looked at my glass of water for a moment. Then I answered calmly. "The system recognized my name." No one spoke after that. Because they were beginning to understand something they had never considered before. The quiet cousin, the one who never argued, the one they believed would accept any room without question. They had written instructions into the resort system assigning him the lowest category available, without realizing that the same system also recorded who actually owned the building they were staying in. The reunion ended 2 days later. No announcements were made. No explanations were offered to the entire family. The ocean remained calm. The resort continued operating exactly as it always did. But inside our small group, something had shifted permanently. Word spread quietly after lunch that afternoon. Not because I told anyone. I never did. It moved through the family the same way uncomfortable truths often move, through fragments. Someone overheard the operations director speaking to a manager. Someone noticed the way staff members greeted me. Someone asked a question that Daniel could not answer. Eventually, the pieces connected. By the second evening, most of them understood. Daniel approached me once near the elevators. His confidence from the first night had disappeared. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. Mark tried a different approach later. "You could have just told us." "I wasn't asked." Melissa avoided long conversations entirely. When we passed each other in the hallway, she simply nodded and continued walking. The apologies were quiet, incomplete. Not everyone offered one. My aunt was the only person who spoke about it directly. We stood on the balcony during the final sunset, the same place where the first dinner had taken place. "They're embarrassed," she said. "That's understandable. You could have corrected them immediately." "Yes, but you didn't." I looked out across the water. "No." She studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. "Sometimes consequences speak more clearly than explanations." The next morning, families began checking out. Suitcases rolled through the lobby again. Children carried beach toys toward waiting cars, normal departures. When it was time for me to leave, I returned my key card at the front desk. The receptionist thanked me for my stay. Behind her, the system quietly closed the reservation file. Every instruction remained recorded. Every name. Every room assignment. Nothing erased. The economy room stayed exactly as it had been all weekend. I never asked to move. And no one in my family ever mentioned the room again. They simply left the resort knowing something they had not known before. Not about the building, not about the company that owned it, but about the quiet person they had assumed they understood, and about the consequences of writing instructions into systems that remember everything.